The air in the private dining room at the Corinthian was thick, expensive, and carried the faint aroma of truffle oil mixed with old money. This wasn't simply a dinner, it was a ceremony of power. Daniel Sterling knew precisely how to orchestrate such moments. He had constructed his entire professional existence, his financial empire truly, on the fundamental principle that perception constituted 90% of reality. He wasn't merely intelligent, he was the visionary, the irreplaceable strategist, the individual who could stride into a financial catastrophe, gather the smoldering wreckage, and reconstruct a work of art from the ruins, all while dressed in a flawlessly tailored Italian suit that cost more than the average person's yearly housing expenses. Tonight, Daniel was presiding over his court. The table was constructed of mahogany, buffed to a reflective sheen, catching the gentle illumination of the low-hanging crystal chandelier. Surrounding him sat a dozen of New York's most formidable power players, hedge fund executives, several technology entrepreneurs who had recently taken their companies public, and most crucially, his principal client, Arthur Vance. Arthur Vance, imposing in stature, with a distinctive mane of silver hair and a well-earned reputation for demolishing competitors before his morning coffee, was radiating satisfaction. He belonged to that rare breed of billionaire who didn't merely spend capital, he weaponized it. And tonight, he was deploying lavish praise upon Daniel like a decorated general distributing commendations. "Look around this room, everyone," Arthur declared, raising his glass of Bordeaux, the delicate clinking barely disturbing the reverent hush of the space. "6 months ago, we were staring down a catastrophic liquidity crisis in the Asia portfolio, an absolute disaster. I contacted Daniel. I handed him complete control and said, 'Fix this mess.' And he delivered." Daniel offered a measured, carefully practiced smile, modest, yet simultaneously acknowledging the accuracy of the statement. He was leaning back slightly in his chair, one hand resting casually on the edge of his tablet, which displayed a pristine, minimalist slide presentation. He had just concluded his explanation of the intricate restructuring maneuver that had, on paper at least, stabilized Arthur's holdings. The genius performance required surgical precision. Daniel never employed terminology that was excessively technical for the audience, but he consistently used vocabulary that implied he was operating on an intellectual plane far above everyone else present. He was the interpreter of chaos, transforming complex risk into digestible narrative. It was simply a matter of realigning core assets against shifting market sentiment, Daniel said smoothly, his voice measured and assured. He made it sound as straightforward as changing a light bulb, even though the maneuver had involved leveraging 3 separate sovereign debt instruments and infuriating 2 different regulatory agencies. Arthur's wife, Patricia, a woman whose collection of jewelry probably required dedicated security personnel, smiled warmly at Daniel. Their daughter, Chloe, sat across the table, playing with her fork, looking profoundly uninterested in the discussion of portfolio optimization. She was 8 years old, wearing a pink dress with a small bow, and seemed far more fascinated by the pattern on her plate than by anything the adults were saying. And then there was Clara. Clara was practically invisible in this room. She was Arthur's junior assistant, someone who managed the calendar and processed the expense reports. She was 24, dressed in a practical gray blazer, and positioned at the far end of the table, closer to the service entrance than to the center of attention. Nobody ever introduced Clara.
She was background furniture, but furniture that possessed access to all the confidential memoranda. Clara kept her eyes lowered, following the conversation but never participating. She was the one who understood the authentic numbers, the messy preliminary drafts, the late-night emails where Daniel's polished exterior occasionally fractured under pressure. As Daniel continued his presentation, gesturing toward a graph that illustrated a projected recovery in the 4th quarter, a graph that was essentially a work of optimistic fiction, albeit beautiful fiction, Arthur slapped the table lightly. "You see, this is precisely why he's irreplaceable. I told him this very morning, Daniel. I said, you're a genius. The finest expertise money can purchase. Arthur looked around the table, his expression challenging anyone to contradict him. Daniel felt the familiar, intoxicating rush of validation. This was the moment he existed for, the public confirmation of his intellectual superiority. He allowed a brief pause, permitting the word genius to hover in the air, reverberating off the Venetian plaster walls. He had completed the main presentation, and now the waiters were moving in to clear the salad plates and pour additional wine. Daniel picked up his tablet, preparing to transition to the more informal, celebratory portion of the evening. That's when the detail captured Clara's attention. Earlier that afternoon, Daniel had been in a frantic, confidential meeting with Arthur's CFO, finalizing the fee structure for this 6-month engagement. In his rush to pack up and make his grand entrance at dinner, Daniel had forgotten a single, unremarkable manila folder on the corner of the conference table. The folder was substantial, bound with a rubber band, and slightly open. It was tucked between Daniel's place setting and the centerpiece, an elaborate arrangement of white orchids.
Clara, the silent observer, had the perfect vantage point. From where she sat, she could see the top document of the contract inside the folder. It was dense with fine print, but the numbers were impossible to miss. Her eyes drifted past the section labeled Scope of Services and landed squarely on the bolded section, Retainer and Success Fees. Daniel had just been praised as irreplaceable, the individual who fixed the liquidity crisis. He had presented projections showing stabilization and future growth. What he hadn't mentioned, and what the tablet presentation artfully concealed, was that the Asia portfolio had, in fact, registered an overall loss over the past 6 months, albeit a smaller loss than initially projected. It was a managed catastrophe, not a triumph. Clara squinted slightly, reading the document that was never supposed to leave Daniel's office. Fee structure, base consulting fee 6 months, $8 million. She swallowed hard. $8 million for managing a loss. Her eyes traveled down further to a handwritten notation scribbled in red ink next to a clause about the initial advance payment. It was a note from the CFO, barely legible, but undeniably clear. Initial advance, $2 million. Check returned. Insufficient funds. Resubmit. Clara froze. A check from Arthur Vance, the man currently calling Daniel a genius, had bounced, and Daniel was still here, presenting himself as the savior, collecting the remaining $6 million. She felt a sudden heat rise in her cheeks. This wasn't just high finance. This was a performance of power constructed on shaky foundations. She quickly looked away, worried that her intense focus on the folder would draw attention. Meanwhile, Daniel, oblivious to the exposed paper trail, was accepting another round of applause.
So, Daniel, what's the next move? You've stabilized the ship, Arthur asked, leaning forward conspiratorially. We need a fresh strategy for the European markets. Something bold. Something only you can execute. Daniel grinned, running a hand over his chin. We'll need to discuss the new engagement terms, of course, Arthur. But I have some preliminary thoughts on leveraging distressed assets in Germany. It's highly risky, but the yield potential is astronomical. The word risky was the only honest word Daniel had used all evening. It was precisely at this moment, when the room was buzzing with the anticipation of Daniel's next $1 million brainstorm, that Chloe Vance, the billionaire's 8-year-old daughter, finally stopped playing with her fork. Chloe wasn't involved in the family business, obviously, but she was bright. She had overheard her father on the phone the week before, using words like bad numbers and big problem. She had also been learning about money in school. She had been watching her father and Daniel for the last hour, listening to all the compliments, but she was also quietly looking at the slide projected onto the screen built into the wall. It was the slide showing the final performance of the Asia portfolio. She had been working on subtraction problems in 3rd grade, and she knew that when you had a minus sign, it meant you lost something. Chloe looked from the screen, which still showed a small, obvious negative sign next to the final percentage, to Daniel, the man being praised as a hero. And then her eyes landed on the folder. The manila folder was slightly open, and the light from the chandelier caught the bold, dark print of the dollar signs, right where Clara had been looking moments before.
She couldn't read all the complicated words, but she could see the number, $8 million, and next to it, the red ink.
Chloe didn't know the etiquette of billion-dollar dinners. She just knew her math facts, and she knew when something didn't make sense. She pointed a small finger, still slightly sticky from the dessert she'd been picking at earlier, straight at the folder. Her voice, high and thin, cut through the low hum of conversation like a bell. Excuse me?" she said, her voice small but clear. The entire table paused. Arthur Vance looked slightly annoyed that his daughter had interrupted a crucial moment of strategic planning. "Yes, sweetie?" Arthur asked, a hint of impatience in his tone. Chloe ignored her father and addressed Daniel directly, her gaze steady, almost confused. "Mr. Sterling," she said, using the formal title carefully, the way her mother had taught her. "Your chart thingy shows that the money still went down this time, even after you fixed it. That's a negative number, right? That means you lost, like in my math workbook." Daniel's smile faltered, but only for a millisecond. He was accustomed to tough questions, but usually from seasoned analysts, not elementary school children. "It was a controlled loss, Chloe," Daniel explained patiently, leaning toward her with what he hoped was a kind expression. "We prevented a much worse situation. That stabilization is the victory." "I get that," Chloe said, her small face scrunched up in concentration. "But if it's still a losing number, why are we paying $8 million? That's like a lot of money. My teacher said you should get paid when you do a good job and make things better, not worse." She said it with the simple, devastating logic of a child who had just learned about allowances and earning rewards for chores. A few senior partners shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was the kind of detail you discussed behind closed doors, not in front of the wives and the waitstaff.
Daniel opened his mouth, ready to launch into a sophisticated explanation about value versus raw profit, about the cost of preventing ruin. But Chloe wasn't done. Her eyes had landed on the red ink, the bounced check notation. "And also," she continued, her voice gaining a child's innocent confidence, fueled by the nervous silence of the room, "if you are super smart and really good at your job like Daddy says, why does that paper right there say that the first check, the $2 million one, bounced? My piggy bank book at school says when checks bounce, it means there isn't enough money. Did we run out of money?" She asked it with genuine curiosity, the way a child asks why the sky is blue or why vegetables are good for you. The question landed on the polished mahogany like a thunderclap. The air rushed out of the room. Want to know what happened next? Subscribe to receive stories about power, deception, and the moment everything falls apart. Join other listeners who love these psychological thrillers. Daniel Sterling, the irreplaceable strategist, the man whose words usually flowed like a perfectly curated stream of financial wisdom, found that his throat had seized up completely. The practiced smile was gone, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. He couldn't answer. He couldn't even formulate a plausible deflection. The raw, exposed truth of the bounced check, the sign that even Arthur Vance's empire was strained, and that Daniel was chasing a debt, had been spoken aloud by an 8-year-old who still believed in the tooth fairy. The conversations at the neighboring tables, which had previously been a low, polite murmur, seemed to vanish. Silence swallowed the room whole. A waiter, who had been gliding toward the table with a bottle of very expensive grappa, stopped dead in his tracks, frozen mid-pour, his eyes fixed on the manila folder.
Clara, the junior assistant who had read the note moments before, immediately dropped her gaze, staring intently at the linen napkin in her lap, wishing desperately that the floor would open up and swallow her whole. The truth was out, and it felt radioactive. Arthur Vance, the great billionaire, slowly reached out one hand. He didn't look at Daniel. His eyes were fixed on the contract. With agonizing slowness, he pushed the manila folder shut, securing the rubber band around the contract. The click of the folder snapping shut was the loudest sound in the entire restaurant. Arthur placed the folder back on the table, exactly where Daniel had left it. He still hadn't looked at his consultant. He looked instead at his wife, then back at the table. "Patty," Arthur said, his voice flat, devoid of its earlier booming enthusiasm. "Did you try the sea bass? It's spectacular." He tried to restart the dinner. to rewind the last 30 seconds. The senior partners dutifully picked up their forks, but the rhythm was broken. The conversation did not resume. The wine tasted like ashes. Daniel Sterling remained silent, the word genius now sounding like a cruel joke echoing in the sudden, deep quiet. He was no longer the centerpiece. He was just a man who hadn't been paid, sitting next to a contract that proved it. The dinner continued, or rather, it limped on. But for the rest of the evening, Arthur Vance never presented Daniel Sterling to anyone again. If new guests entered the private room, Arthur simply ignored the man sitting silently by the orchids. Daniel Sterling, the indispensable genius, had become just another face at the table.
That moment stretched out like a rubber band pulled too tight, thin and vibrating with tension. The truffle oil and expensive perfume couldn't mask the smell of professional death. Daniel Sterling sat there, paralyzed. His mind, usually a high-speed processor capable of calculating derivatives and predicting market shifts, was now just whirring, stuck in a loop. Bounce check, bounce check, bounce check. He tried to breathe, to formulate a response that would reestablish the narrative. He could talk about technical banking delays or administrative errors, or maybe even blame the CFO. But Arthur Vance, the client who had just called him a genius, had already closed the folder. That slow, deliberate action was a verdict. It was the closing of a chapter, not just a folder. Arthur Vance, master of social camouflage, continued his performance. He talked about the sea bass, he complimented the wine, he even asked one of the hedge fund managers about his upcoming trip to Aspen. But the conversation was hollow. It was like watching a play where the lead actor had just forgotten all his lines, but the supporting cast kept whispering their cues anyway, hoping the scene would fix itself. Nobody looked at Daniel. To be ignored by Arthur Vance was worse than being yelled at. Yelling meant you still mattered. Being ignored meant you had ceased to exist in his universe. Daniel realized his hands were sweating, soaking into the pristine linen napkin resting on his lap. He felt a sudden, crushing weight of reality. He wasn't the indispensable genius anymore. He was the guy owed money by the host, the guy whose financial stability was now publicly questionable. If the great Arthur Vance's check bounced, what did that say about Arthur? And if Daniel was chasing that check, what did that say about Daniel?
The other investors, the heavy hitters who had been nodding along with every word Daniel spoke just 10 minutes ago, were now masters of peripheral vision. They talked across him, leaning around his silence. They discussed mergers, politics, and the miserable traffic on the Long Island Expressway. Anything but the Asia portfolio. The most painful part was watching their eyes. They weren't judging Daniel's intelligence. They were judging his status. In this world, the biggest sin wasn't failure. It was the appearance of scrambling. The bounced check note proved he was scrambling. Clara, still staring at her napkin, felt the heat radiating off the central drama. She understood the gravity of Chloe's question instantly. Chloe had articulated the quiet, messy truth that the finance world works so hard to bury. Sometimes the emperor has no clothes, and sometimes the emperor's bank account is thinner than advertised. Clara finally risked a glance up. She saw Daniel's face. The smooth, confident mask had cracked, revealing raw panic underneath. He looked lost, adrift in the sea of mahogany and crystal. The dinner finally sputtered to an end an hour later. It was a miserable, protracted affair. The dessert, a towering chocolate creation, was barely touched. When the goodbyes began, the choreography of exclusion was brutal. Arthur Vance stood up, effortlessly regaining his commanding posture. He shook hands vigorously with the tech founders and the hedge fund managers. He made promises of future collaborations, patting shoulders and exchanging quiet, meaningful comments. When the line reached Daniel, Arthur offered a hand that was cold and brief. "Thank you for coming, Daniel," Arthur said. The tone was polite, but utterly devoid of warmth.
It was the tone you use for a caterer, not a collaborator. We'll be in touch.
"We'll be in touch" was corporate code for "Don't call us, we'll call you when we figure out how to manage the PR disaster you just became." Daniel tried one last time to salvage the moment, to inject the necessary veneer of professionalism. "Of course, Arthur. Regarding the European strategy—" Arthur didn't even pause. He was already turning to thank the next couple. "Clara will handle scheduling any follow-up meetings you might require." Daniel felt the insult like a physical blow. He was being handed off to the junior assistant, the person he barely bothered to acknowledge when he swept into Arthur's office. His direct line to the billionaire was severed. As Daniel gathered his belongings, the sleek tablet, the expensive leather briefcase, he had to reach for the manila folder. He grabbed it quickly, bundling it into his case as if it were a dirty secret. He avoided everyone's eyes, especially Chloe's, who was now swinging her legs under the table, humming quietly to herself, already having moved on to thinking about her bedtime story, the picture of childish innocence having already detonated the bomb. He mumbled his farewells and left the Corinthian, stepping out of the air-conditioned opulence and into the humid New York night. The heat of the city felt oppressive, a harsh contrast to the cool, controlled environment he'd just left. He hailed a black car, sinking into the plush leather seat. As the driver pulled away, Daniel pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen, drafting a series of emergency emails. To Arthur Vance, subject, immediate clarification regarding fee structure and payment delay. To Robert Davies, CFO, subject, urgent, the check issue. He needed to get ahead of the story. He needed to reframe the narrative. It wasn't a bounced check. It was a temporary processing anomaly. He was a genius, and geniuses don't chase bad debt. He sent the emails, but a deep, sickening knot formed in his stomach. He knew the truth was already airborne. In the world of high finance, gossip travels faster than fiber optics. By the time he reached his penthouse apartment in Tribeca, the Whisper Network would already have the story, embellished and exaggerated. Daniel Sterling is broke, and Vance is cutting him loose. The next morning, Daniel woke up to silence. Not the peaceful silence of a restful night, but the deafening silence of an empty inbox and a phone that wasn't ringing. He usually received a flood of emails before 7 a.m., requests for consultation, invitations to speak at exclusive conferences, and detailed schedules from Arthur's office. Today, nothing. He checked his sent folder. The urgent emails to Arthur and the CFO, Robert Davies, remained unanswered. No read receipts, no automated acknowledgments. Total radio silence. By 9 a.m., Daniel was pacing his living room, the view of the Manhattan skyline doing little to soothe his nerves. He tried calling Davies directly. It went straight to voicemail. He tried Arthur Vance's private line. A professional female voice, not Arthur's secretary, but a general corporate operator answered. "Vance Holdings," the voice said neutrally. "This is Daniel Sterling. I need to speak with Mr. Vance immediately regarding the Asia portfolio follow-up." There was a slight, almost imperceptible pause on the other end. "I apologize, Mr. Sterling. Mr. Vance's calendar is entirely booked for the foreseeable future. I can direct you to his administrative assistant for scheduling." "I was told to speak with Clara, his junior assistant." Daniel forced the words out, tasting the humiliation. "One moment, please." He was transferred. The line rang 3 times, and then Clara's voice, small and professional, answered. Clara speaking.
"Clara, it's Daniel Sterling. I need to speak to Arthur or Robert Davies immediately about the discussion last night." Clara's voice, usually timid, held a new, detached firmness. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling. I have been instructed to manage all communications regarding your current engagement." "Manage communications? Clara, this is high-level strategy. I need to talk about the payment structure and the European strategy we discussed." "Mr. Sterling, I have a memo here from Mr. Vance, dictated early this morning.
It states that all further work on the European market strategy is currently on hold, pending an internal performance review of the Asia portfolio results. Daniel felt his blood pressure spike. A performance review? We just had a performance review last night, and Arthur called me a genius. Yes, sir, Clara said, completely unruffled. The review is being conducted by the internal compliance team, retroactive to the start of the engagement. Until that is complete, all services are suspended. And the outstanding fees? Daniel asked, his voice tight. Regarding the outstanding fees, Clara continued, as if reading from a script, which she probably was. The initial $2 million advance is being reprocessed today. The remaining $6 million of the base consulting fee, per Clause 4B in the contract, is contingent upon the satisfactory conclusion of the performance review. Daniel leaned against the cold glass of his window. This was it. Arthur wasn't just embarrassed. He was using the incident to justify cutting Daniel out and possibly cutting his losses on the fee. Arthur Vance was a shark. He hadn't just shut the folder. He had opened a legal investigation. Clara, this is unacceptable. I have fulfilled the terms of the contract. The stabilization of the assets is the success factor.
I am simply relaying the instructions, Mr. Sterling, Clara stated. If you have any legal concerns, you may direct them to Mr. Vance's general counsel, Ms. Hernandez. And just like that, Daniel Sterling, the indispensable genius, had been relegated from the strategic advisor to a potential legal adversary, managed by a 24-year-old assistant. He hung up, slamming the phone onto the marble counter. The silence returned, heavy and mocking. He spent the rest of the morning trying to contact his other high-profile clients. One call went to voicemail. The second, to a major energy CEO he was advising, was answered by his CEO's own executive assistant, who informed Daniel, with practiced regret, that Mr. Harrison has had to adjust his calendar, and your scheduled meeting this week is no longer necessary. The disease was spreading. The rumor had reached the trading desks and the private equity firms. Daniel's currency was trust and perceived infallibility. Both were now bankrupt. Meanwhile, across town, in the gleaming minimalist offices of Vance Holdings, Clara sat at her desk, feeling strangely calm. She had just executed the professional termination of Daniel Sterling. She wasn't celebrating. She was simply doing her job. But for the first time, she felt her job was important. Arthur Vance had looked at her this morning, really looked at her, and handed her the reins of the cleanup operation. Clara, Arthur had said, his voice quiet but sharp, as he handed her the memo. You saw the folder. You know the details. You handle him. No one else needs to know the specific mechanics of the payment delay. Just manage the communication stream. Keep him away from me.
Clara was the gatekeeper. She was the one who knew that the $2 million check hadn't bounced because Arthur was broke. Arthur Vance was never broke. It had bounced because Arthur had moved a massive block of liquid capital into a rapid short-term investment the day before, leaving the operating account temporarily dry. It was a sign of aggressive, risk-heavy maneuvering, not insolvency. But the optics, especially when coupled with a portfolio loss, were devastating. Clara printed out the contract, the $8 million document. She read the fine print again, specifically the section Daniel had glossed over. The satisfactory conclusion clause was deliberately vague, giving Arthur an enormous loophole. Daniel's confidence had blinded him. He had assumed his genius status would override any contractual ambiguity. She placed the contract in a new, clean folder. As she did so, the office door opened, and Robert Davies, the CFO, walked in, looking harried. Clara, you handled the Sterling call, right? Davies asked, running a hand through his thinning hair. Yes, Mr. Davies. I informed him of the performance review and the suspension of services. Davies sighed, leaning against her desk. Good. Look, Arthur is furious. Not about the loss. He can handle a managed loss. He's furious that his daughter made him look like a fool in front of the entire finance committee, and that Sterling gave her the ammunition. The folder was open, sir, Clara noted quietly. Doesn't matter. Sterling should have been meticulous. He sold us perfection. And last night, he delivered sloppy paperwork and exposed the fact that we're having to chase our own capital. It's a disgrace. Davies lowered his voice. Clara, I need you to go through every single invoice and expense report Daniel Sterling has ever submitted. Every lunch, every flight, every item. I want a complete audit, starting now. Clara nodded, pulling up Daniel Sterling's expense files. This was the real work. The quiet, forensic dismantling of a professional reputation. And keep this quiet, Davies added.
Arthur doesn't want to look desperate, and he definitely doesn't want the market thinking we're fighting with our top talent. It needs to look like a mutual parting of ways, based on strategic misalignment. Clara spent the afternoon drowning in Daniel Sterling's impeccable taste. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in travel expenses, private club fees, and lavish dinners that were categorized as client development. Every line item was technically justifiable, but together they painted a picture of extravagant confidence, confidence that was now utterly unwarranted. She noticed one recurring detail. Every single travel receipt listed a charge for an extra bag. She cross-referenced the dates and locations. It wasn't a suitcase. Daniel always carried a specialized, custom-made garment bag for his suits. The genius was meticulous about his wardrobe. 2 days later, Daniel was still in limbo. No meetings, no calls returned. The silence was deafening, amplified by the constant low thrum of the city outside his window. He had tried to reach out to Arthur's wife, Patricia, hoping she might intervene, but her assistant politely informed him that Mrs. Vance was unavailable for the season. He felt the walls closing in. His genius had always been based on access. Without Arthur Vance's endorsement, he was just another highly paid consultant. That evening, Daniel received a thick envelope via special courier. It was from Vance Holdings. Inside was a formal letter from Miss Hernandez, the general counsel, reiterating the suspension of services and demanding that Daniel return all Vance proprietary data immediately. Included in the package was a second, smaller envelope. Inside that was a certified bank check for $2 million. The advance had been paid.
He stared at the check. The money was finally here, but it felt like a poisoned gift. Arthur Vance had paid the debt, not because he respected Daniel, but to remove any public grounds for a legal dispute about non-payment. Arthur was buying Daniel's silence. Daniel knew fundamentally that if he sued Arthur for the remaining $6 million, the legal process would drag him through the mud, exposing the managed loss, the fee structure, and the entire performance over substance strategy he had built his career on. Arthur had him checkmated. Just as Daniel was about to call his own lawyer, his phone buzzed. It was a text message from a former colleague, a man named Marcus who worked at a rival firm. Marcus: "Hey D, heard you had a rough dinner at the Corinthian the other night. Rough crowd." Daniel typed back quickly. Daniel: "Administrative glitch. Nothing serious. Just adjusting the fee structure." Marcus: "Yeah, I heard. Too bad about that performance review. Also, just curious, did you ever settle up with that guy in Miami about the software licensing for the risk model? Heard he was getting aggressive about the ownership rights." Daniel's blood ran cold. The Miami licensing issue was a minor, year-old dispute that was aggressively confidential. How did Marcus know about it? If you're enjoying this story about corporate manipulation and hidden truths, you'll love my channel. I share stories like this every week, plus exclusive content you won't find anywhere else. Hit that subscribe button. It's free. Daniel: "That's private. Why do you ask?" Marcus: "No reason. Just, you know how it is. When the big guys start looking for reasons, they look everywhere. They're running a clean sweep. Be careful, man. Seems like Vance is trying to make a point."
Daniel dropped his phone. A clean sweep. Arthur wasn't just firing him. He was trying to ruin him, ensuring that Daniel couldn't simply jump to a rival and sell the same strategic playbook. Arthur was weaponizing the internal compliance team to find any existing vulnerability, any past misstep that could be leaked to the press if Daniel pushed back. He realized the horror of the situation. He had built his reputation on the appearance of being untouchable. Now, Arthur Vance was touching everything, dismantling the foundations of Daniel's professional identity brick by brick. He looked at the $2 million check. It was a severance package, a bribe for silence, and an acknowledgement that he was officially banished from the inner circle. Daniel sank into his couch, the expensive suit jacket feeling heavy and restrictive. He was trapped. He could take the $2 million and disappear, or he could fight for the $6 million and risk total public immolation. He chose the path of survival. He needed to understand the full scope of the attack. Who was leading this investigation? Who was feeding the compliance team the confidential details, like the Miami licensing issue? He knew it wouldn't be Arthur. Arthur was too important for petty revenge. It would be someone small, someone unnoticed, someone with the kind of access that Daniel had always overlooked. He thought back to the dinner. The only person who had been actively watching, the person who knew the true context of the numbers, was the one person Arthur had explicitly directed him to contact. Clara, the junior assistant, the ghost in the room. Daniel picked up the phone, his voice tight with forced calm. He called the Vance Holdings general number again. Vance Holdings. Clara, please. Clara answered immediately, her voice still professionally neutral. Mr. Sterling.
Clara, I received the check, thank you. I also received the counsel's letter. I need to understand the specifics of this performance review. Who is compiling the data? The internal compliance team, sir. Yes, but specifically, who is managing the data collection and documentation? Is it Mr. Davies? There was a slight pause, a very slight pause, but Daniel heard it. I am assisting the compliance team with the data collection, Mr. Sterling. As I handle the accounts and expense reports, I have the most immediate access to your historical activity. Daniel closed his eyes. It was Clara. The junior assistant was conducting the forensic audit of his life. The man who had ignored her presence for 6 months was now completely at her mercy. Clara, Daniel said, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. I need you to understand something. I am a very wealthy and powerful man. I can make things very difficult for people who try to interfere with my business. He was trying to intimidate her, a tactic that usually worked on mid-level corporate staff. Clara responded instantly, without any change in volume, but with a chilling clarity. Mr. Sterling, I am working under the direct instruction of Mr. Arthur Vance and the General Counsel's office. My duty is to the firm. I am simply gathering the facts. I suggest you direct all further communication to Miss Hernandez. Have a good evening. Click. The line went dead. Daniel stood in his luxurious, silent penthouse, holding the phone, realizing the devastating truth. He had been outmaneuvered, not by a bigger genius, but by the simplest, most overlooked element in the room. The truth, delivered by an 8-year-old girl who was just learning subtraction, and now being weaponized by the quiet, meticulous assistant he had never bothered to learn the last name of. He had built his career on perception, and now the reality of his exposure was being managed by Clara.
The genius was officially cornered. The silence in Daniel's penthouse wasn't just professional, it was existential. He was used to the constant hum of deals being made, of reputation preceding him into every room. Now, the only sound was the distant siren of a police car, a sound of distant trouble that felt suddenly, chillingly close to home. He had tried to rally his defenses. He spent the entire night calling lawyers, PR consultants, and other billionaires he considered allies. But the door was shut everywhere. The lawyers were cagey, talking about reputational risk. The PR firms recommended a period of low visibility. And his allies? They were suddenly traveling, or in meetings, or simply unavailable. In the world of high finance, no one wants to touch the guy who might be carrying the plague. The narrative Arthur Vance had created was already taking hold. Daniel Sterling was a strategic misalignment. Daniel knew he had one last move. He had to find the biggest leverage point that Clara, or Arthur's compliance team, was preparing to use against him. He couldn't afford to be ambushed again. He called Clara back the next morning. It was 7 a.m., the time he usually dictated terms, not chase information. Clara speaking. Her voice was impossibly crisp. Clara, I understand you are assisting with the audit, Daniel began, trying to keep the intimidation out of his voice, opting instead for a cool, managerial tone. I need to ensure accuracy. Can you provide me with a summary of the scope you are currently investigating? There was no pause this time. She was ready. We are reviewing all contracts, performance metrics, and ancillary expenses related to the Asia engagement, Mr. Sterling. I can confirm we have flagged several items for internal review. Flagged what? Daniel pressed.
For instance, Clara continued, her tone clinical, we are reviewing the ownership structure of the proprietary risk modeling software you utilized. The licensing agreement appears to conflict with the services agreement you signed with Vance Holdings, specifically regarding intellectual property ownership. Daniel felt a cold sweat break out. That was the Miami issue Marcus had hinted at. The software was legally murky, but Daniel had assumed Arthur would never dig that deep. It was too messy, too technical. That is an ongoing legal matter entirely separate from Vance Holdings, Daniel snapped. Understood, Mr. Sterling, Clara replied. However, the expense reports show that Vance Holdings paid for several travel expenses related to the development and maintenance of that software. If the IP is disputed, the compliance team needs to know why the firm was subsidizing its development. Daniel realized the genius of the attack. It wasn't about finding fraud, it was about finding inconvenience. Arthur Vance didn't need to prove Daniel was a criminal, he just needed to prove Daniel was a headache, a liability who mixed his private, messy business with Arthur's pristine empire. And what else, Clara? Daniel asked, the defeat creeping into his voice. I am currently finalizing the review of your travel expenses, she said, specifically the charges related to professional appearance maintenance. My suits? Daniel scoffed. That's a standard business expense. Indeed, Clara confirmed. However, I noted a pattern of charges for specialized custom garment bags, often exceeding the cost of the flight itself, categorized separately from standard luggage fees. Over 6 months, this amounted to an additional $45,000 in charges, Mr. Sterling. While not illegal, the compliance team is questioning the necessity of such lavish, repeated expenditures when the portfolio performance was negative.
The suit bags. The detail that confirmed his obsession with image. Daniel had been so focused on projecting the perfect picture that he had literally paid thousands extra just to ensure his Italian wool never wrinkled, even as the portfolio bled money. He had been undone by his own vanity, meticulously tracked by the person he thought only handled coffee orders. Clara, Daniel said, his voice now barely a whisper, I understand the situation. Please convey to Mr. Vance that I agree that a strategic realignment is necessary. I will formally withdraw from the European strategy discussion and consider the current engagement concluded. I will relay that to Mr. Vance, sir, Clara said, her voice remaining perfectly even. I will also ensure that the $2 million payment is formally registered as the final and complete compensation for all services rendered. She was making him confirm that he was taking the bribe for silence. Daniel swallowed the bitter taste of surrender. Confirmed, he said. Thank you, Mr. Sterling. We will be in touch if any further clarification is required regarding the proprietary data return. She hung up. The genius was officially retired from Vance Holdings. The next few weeks were a slow, public execution of Daniel Sterling's professional life. He released a terse statement citing unforeseen health challenges for his sudden withdrawal from several high-profile engagements, including the Global Strategy Summit in Chicago. But the silence from Arthur Vance was the real killer. Arthur didn't leak anything specific, but the absence of his endorsement was a void that sucked all the light out of Daniel's reputation.
Other clients, already wary of the market volatility, used the rumors as an excuse to cut costs. Daniel's contracts, which were always structured with massive performance incentives and hefty retainers, suddenly looked too risky, too expensive, for an advisor who couldn't even keep his own clients' checks from bouncing. Daniel watched as his carefully constructed world crumbled. The speaking invitations dried up, the requests for interviews stopped. He was still wealthy, but his true currency, his indispensable status, was gone. He was just another consultant with a big price tag and an exposed weakness. He started spending his days pacing the penthouse, looking out over the city that had once worshipped him. He kept thinking about Chloe's small, clear voice, asking simple questions with devastating accuracy, and Clara's quiet, devastating efficiency. They had seen the truth that everyone else,
including Daniel himself, had ignored. Meanwhile, across town, the atmosphere at Vance Holdings had settled into a new, efficient rhythm. The strategic reorganization was complete. Arthur Vance sat in his office, looking over a memo detailing the final actions taken to sever ties with Daniel Sterling. Everything was clean, legally airtight, and managed without a single embarrassing leak to the press. He buzzed his intercom. "Clara, come in." Clara entered, holding a small notebook. She no longer wore the sensible gray blazer. She wore a sharp, well-fitting navy suit, and her posture was noticeably more confident. "Sit down, Clara," Arthur said, gesturing toward the chair opposite his massive desk. Clara sat, waiting. She knew this was the moment. Arthur didn't waste time on platitudes. The Sterling situation is resolved. Cleanly, efficiently. The audit report you compiled was instrumental, particularly the details regarding the intellectual property conflicts. You saved us a considerable headache and potential liability.
He leaned back, finally allowing a small smile, the kind of smile that signals acknowledgement, not affection. You handled yourself with remarkable composure, Clara. You knew the messy details, and you managed the entire communication stream without error, even when Sterling tried to intimidate you. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," she replied simply. "You were invisible before, Clara," Arthur said, his voice suddenly serious. "You handled the expense reports and the scheduling. Now, you know the true foundations of the firm. You know where the cracks are, and you know how to fill them." He picked up a piece of paper from his desk. "I've had Robert Davies draw up a new title for you. Effective immediately, you are Director of Operational Strategy. You will report directly to me, and you will oversee the compliance and internal auditing functions for all new consultant engagements. Your salary, naturally, reflects this new responsibility." Clara didn't gasp or cry. She simply nodded, a slow, deep understanding in her eyes. She hadn't sought the spotlight, but she had earned the power that came from knowing the truth. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," she said. "I accept the role." "Good," Arthur said, standing up, signaling the end of the meeting. "Now I need you to schedule a meeting with the new firm handling the European strategy. Did you see that coming? If you love stories with unexpected twists and power reversals, hit that subscribe button. I publish new stories often that will keep you on the edge of your seat. They seem competent, but I want you to give them a very clear overview of our contractual expectations. And Clara?" "Yes, sir. Make sure their contract specifies that any base fee is strictly contingent on verifiable positive quarterly returns. No more relying on stabilization as a metric for 8-figure payouts. And make sure the payment schedule is ironclad."
"Consider it done, Mr. Vance," Clara replied. She picked up her notebook, her hand steady. She knew exactly how to draft a contract that left no room for the kind of performance Daniel Sterling had delivered. She had learned the lesson the hard way, by cleaning up the mess of the genius who thought details didn't matter. Months later, Daniel Sterling was living a different life. He had sold his Tribeca penthouse and moved to a quieter, smaller estate outside Greenwich, Connecticut. He was still consulting, but for smaller, less visible clients who paid in cash and didn't require the grand public coronation he once demanded. He was working from a home office one rainy afternoon, reviewing a modest contract for a regional manufacturing firm. The numbers were small, the stakes low. He paused, looking at the draft fee structure. He found himself meticulously checking every clause, every contingency, and every payment term. He even had his own CFO review the client's bank history to ensure liquidity. He was no longer the swaggering genius. He was a cautious, paranoid professional. His phone buzzed with a news alert. Vance Holdings reports strong Q2 growth, credits internal operational changes. He clicked the link. The article was bland, corporate PR, but buried deep in the text was a quote from Arthur Vance, praising his new Director of Operational Strategy for implementing tighter fiscal controls and reducing external liabilities. The name wasn't mentioned, but Daniel knew who it was. He closed his laptop, a profound sense of irony washing over him. The genius had been brought down by the truth, and the truth had elevated the person who actually managed the mechanics of success.
Daniel Sterling had built his empire on the belief that the big picture was all that mattered, the grand strategy, the dazzling performance. He had forgotten that every empire rests on tiny, overlooked foundations. And sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room is the one sitting silently at the end of the table, reading the fine print you left exposed. He stood up, running a hand over his chin. He still wore expensive suits, but he had stopped checking the cost of the garment bags. The performance was over. He was simply working now, trying to rebuild a career based not on the dazzling claim of genius, but on the quiet, painful reality of diligence. He had learned his lesson. In the high-stakes world of billions, the details always matter, and the people you ignore are often the ones holding the ledger. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed someone's carefully constructed image crumble in an instant? Share your story. And if you want more stories like this, tales of ambition, downfall, and the hidden mechanics of power, subscribe now. See you in the next story.